Alright, so this is going to be the first part of a four-part series in which I go over the first four completed rounds from Record of Ragnarok. So I originally planned on doing a sort of series overview video before doing these. After going over it, I decided I didn't like it. So we're just not going to do that. We're just going to go right into the fight discussions, I guess. So, we're going to be starting off with round one. I'm just sort of going to be going through the chapters and just skimming over what's happening and then talking about important stuff and giving my opinion on them and stuff like that. So anyway, the series starts off in chapter 1 with the Convention of the Gods. Every 1,000 years, the gods convene to decide whether or not mankind will be allowed to live for another 1,000 years or if they'll be destroyed. This is where we meet Brynhild and Geir, the oldest and youngest of the Valkyrie sisters, respectively, and they interrupt the meeting of the gods because the gods have decided unanimously, which is kind of weird for a reason that we'll get into later with the fourth round, to wipe out humanity. And then Brynhild brings up this old law in their constitution or whatever, saying that if the gods decide to wipe out humanity, then they have to have a fighting tournament. And if humanity wins, they get to survive anyway, I guess. Which is kind of a weird law that they would put in place, but whatever. I don't really care because that means we get to do this. So the gods originally kind of scoff at the idea of fighting the humans, which gives you some early characterization into what the gods are like. They're very arrogant and douchey. So Brynhild just sort of prods them into agreeing to it by asking them if they're chickening out, and of course the gods, being the gods, are like, fuck no, man, we'll fuck up those humans. So then they agree to do it anyway. Or Zeus agrees to do it because Zeus is the chairman of the Council of Valhalla, which I get because Zeus is probably the most famous god around. He's not like the oldest, and he probably shouldn't be the most powerful considering we have like Shiva here, and he's supposed to be a creation deity. Well, Zeus is not, but whatever, I don't really care about that. So after the gods agree to do the Ragnarok tournament, we get some talking with Geir and Brynhild about how it's their job to protect humanity and stuff. And then we get a little scene from a guy named Incubus. Incubus is a demon, which is interesting because we have not seen anyone else who is a demon so far. I know Beelzebub is on the roster for the future fights, but we don't know what they're doing with him yet. At least by the time I'm recording this, who knows, he may be one of the next fighters, which I think he will be. But Incubus shows up for a minute. He's kind of a creepy asshole, all of feeling up Brynhild and stuff. And then he pulls his cock out, which is something that we didn't notice until like a week ago, which is remarkable because this chapter came out in like 2017. So somehow no one noticed that for like a year and a half. But then he gets annihilated instantly, and then we see Thor. So first off, I would like to say that Thor's design with this overcoat is fucking awesome. I really like this costume that he has on. I actually wish that he kept this on for when he was fighting. But he just sort of shows up, immediately kills Incubus, and then just fucks off, I guess. Very menacing, scares the shit out of Brynhild and Geir. And then we get into the part where Brynhild has to select fighters for humanity. Then we go into the Valhalla arena, and you get a nice look at what our battle arena is going to be, just sort of a very big coliseum. I think all of humanity from all of history is supposed to be here. At least I think that's implied. Which is weird, because it's very obviously not big enough for that, but who knows, maybe there are people outside the stands. You also get a look at our main God Commentators, even though most of these people don't say anything through the whole fight. You got Zeus, Aphrodite, Shiva, Odin. The only one that really says anything during this fight is Zeus, and then Odin a little bit, which is to be expected when we get into our actual fight. And then we're introduced to Heimdall, our commentator, like our main commentator, the announcer for the fight. I like this little goblin design that he has. It's very unique. I haven't seen anything like it for any other interpretations of him, but it's pretty neat. He just gives the rundown of what the tournament's going to be like. One representative from each side, and then they fight to the death. So no knocking people out or anything. If a character loses, they're dead. Like, they're not coming back. After that, we get introduced to our first fighter, the Vanguard of the Gods, who is, of course, Thor. And he gets a little bit of a hype speech. This opening has, like, some cool angles in the panels, but, like, compared to every single other intro that comes after this, it's just kind of boring. Like, he just walks out there and then takes his coat off, which is alright. And then you get Odin speaking, one of the only times he speaks in the whole series so far, just telling Thor to crush and annihilate the humans, which gives a little bit of insight into Odin's character, which we don't get much of so far. He is on the roster, so we'll obviously be seeing a lot more from him at some point, but I don't expect him to fight until the very end of the series. Once Thor is revealed, we get the introduction of the human fighter, which is a very big step up from Thor's. You have, like, an entire ancient Chinese army, like, banging on drums and shit, as Heimdall is, like, yelling the hype speech about how the vanguard of mankind is going to preserve the history of mankind. And then a big horse comes out. This is probably the buffest fucking horse I've ever seen in my life. And the human fighter is wrapped up in, like, these black cloth things. I have no idea what these are or why he's in them, but, like, him breaking them out of them looks real cool. The strongest man since the dawn of history, which I guess suggests that one of the people coming up later is the strongest since before history. He gets some really good shots, but yeah, it's Ryofu Hosen, or Lubu. I don't know anything about his real-world history or why he has two names. I'm gonna assume that Lubu is just like his nickname, because they've got Lubu and then Ryofu Hosen and little, like, under it. So yeah, that's your matchup for the first fight. So before the fight actually starts, you get introduced to some side characters from each of the fighters' respective backstories. You get Forseti, who's the Norse god of justice. He seems kind of lame, to be honest. And then you have these other dudes from China, from Lubu's backstory, and they seem kind of neat, but I gotta say, this fight's probably got some of the least interesting characters that we've gotten for commentary out of all the rounds so far. But then Heimdall blows the Gjallarhorn and announces the start of Ragnarok. Then we get something pretty neat. You've got Thor and Lubu both putting their guard down. They put both their weapons down, and they start menacingly walking towards each other very slowly. And they each see who can get the first strike. And then they both hit their weapons together. Like, Lubu does the attack, and Thor picks up Mjolnir. Oh, yes, I haven't mentioned this yet, somehow. This somehow totally didn't even cross my mind. But with most depictions of Thor, Mjolnir is just like a normal hammer. I know in Marvel movies, they have that whole thing they made up about Thor, mostly Thor, only being able to pick up Mjolnir because you must be worthy to pick it up. Well, in Norse mythology, the way Mjolnir works is that Thor is the only person strong enough to pick it up. So, using their anime brain, the author of the manga decided that that means Mjolnir should be the size of a fucking car. Which it is. So you have Lubu with his halberd going against Thor with his gigantic hammer Mjolnir. And Lubu actually manages to knock Thor back, and they start to have a little bit of a back and forth swinging at each other, which is pretty neat. They do that cool thing, that cool anime thing where they clash and the ground shatters beneath them because of how strong they are. And they reveal that Lubu and Thor are supposedly equal in strength. The strongest human and the strongest of the Nordic gods are an equal match for each other. So then Thor decides to pull out some lightning, which looks pretty neat at first, but then when it goes later on to when he's grabbing his hammer, it looks way too artificial. Like the lines, when he has his hand and he's about to grab Mjolnir with his other hand with the lightning, it just looks kind of shitty. But he grabs Mjolnir with both hands and then falls backwards, super bent over. And then they reveal this is actually his battle stance for his special move called Thor's Hammer. Now, when Thor does the Thor's Hammer move, there's this giant explosion and everyone's like, oh shit, guess Lubu died, that sucked. But then they reveal that Lubu actually managed to cut Thor's chest open. Even Thor is super shocked by this. And Lubu and Thor start to have this neat back and forth about how each of them are really cool, which I quite like. None of the other fighters have really had this sort of camaraderie, at least not this early in the fight, so that's actually pretty nice. Then you get Lubu's backstory about how he's a super strong guy that was going around, like, murdering animals with knives and stuff, like this giant, impossibly huge bear he just killed by himself. And then you have, as he's getting older, he's facing entire armies by himself. And he's so cool that all of these other guys just start following him, even though he never asked for it. So I guess that's sort of like a Chad move or something, having a bunch of people that follow you even though you never asked for it. But then we get into the real meat of Lubu's character, which is the fact that he realized he was too strong and that no one else could ever fight him. Which is sort of the thing you get with people like Saitama or Yujiro Hanma, where when you're the strongest guy in the world, no one can really fight you anymore, so it gets super boring. There's also this really cool imagery of Lubu standing on top of a mountain of dead bodies, which is pretty awesome. And I guess it's here where they show what that cloth or leather stuff he was wrapped in earlier. It was the stuff they used to restrain him when he turned himself in to be executed. Because Lubu has sort of just been going around killing and betraying everyone just so he can find people to fight. This is the part where they start to get into some of the creative liberties, more so with characters' backstories. So the story was that when Lubu was being brought to execution, he was crying and begging for his life. But in this, it was actually that he was yawning because he was so bored waiting to be executed. So Lubu was so bored of living that he just couldn't wait for his own death, I guess. But now he's happy because he's able to find someone strong enough to fight him in Thor. And then we get some dialogue between Zeus and Hermes. Now we've been introduced to Hermes, who is the butler character, and he's one of the real commentators. He's going to show up a lot in all of the fights now. But this is the part where they start to explain the Voland, which is the idea that the Valkyries are able to turn themselves into divine weapons so that the humans can actually fight the gods, because the idea is that gods can only be harmed by divine weapons. So this is where we're introduced to Rangris, who's the fourth Valkyrie sister. She seems pretty neat, and they explain that she's been brought along to become Lubu's weapon, because by using her as a divine weapon, she'll be able to break Thor's Yarngriper gauntlets. Now, the deal with the Yarngriper is that they think that Thor needs those gloves in order to be able to lift Mjolnir, because it's just such a fucking absurd weapon that they can't imagine that Thor would be able to lift him without any sort of assistance. Yeah, now it's right here where we get the explanation of what exactly the Voland is. And then, right after that, Lubu uses it and attacks the Yarngriper and destroys it, which I guess they were supposed to be unbreakable or something, but because of Rangri's ability or whatever that comes with her name, Shieldbreaker, she's able to break through any sort of defense, including the Yarngriper. Then we get a little bit of explanation about how Mjolnir is supposed to be basically the strongest divine weapon ever. It supposedly has planet-busting capabilities, which is kind of ridiculous, but Lubu breaks the Yarngriper anyway. And then Thor looks super shook. I don't see his face. You don't see his face look like this at any other point in the fight. It's almost kind of disturbing to look at. Then you get everyone in the crowd's reactions to it. You've got the Chinese guys from when Lubu was around getting all hyped about how awesome Lubu is, and how awesome it is that Lubu is from their time period. So then you have Hermes explaining the idea that the Valkyries are supposed to guide the souls of the dead, but how they are supposedly going to rebel against the gods at some point. Yeah, how originally they were supposed to collect the souls of the dead to create an army for heaven, which plays into Norse mythology with the idea of them taking the souls of warriors to serve in the army for Ragnarok, the end of the world. But instead here they're thinking about the idea that instead the Valkyries would use themselves to create an army that could challenge the gods, which is what happens with Voland. You also see Hermes turn a doll into a divine weapon. So it seems like gods can just sort of do that on the fly, whereas the Valkyries have to, like, merge themselves with the human in order to create the divine weapon, which shows sort of the difference in, I guess, magical abilities between the Valkyrie and the gods. Then we go back to the combat, and Lubu gets another hit on Thor, and Zeus starts getting pissed and then gets super fucking horny. Because as we'll learn from Zeus when we see him a lot more, is that he seems to really like fighting and really like screwing around with people. But after that, the Yarngriper has been broken, and everyone assumes that means that Thor can't use Mjolnir anymore. And then Mjolnir starts melting, and then it starts pulsating like it has a heartbeat. And then Thor starts talking to it and says, "Oh, you've awakened." Then Mjolnir grows veins, which I guess it's hard to tell with the black and white art. It kind of looks like molten metal, but at the same time it kind of looks organic. Though I guess the idea is supposed to be that Mjolnir is a living thing, so seems like it could be either, really. Then you get more of an explanation of the Yarngriper's true purpose from Zeus, who's talking about how they were actually used to protect Mjolnir from the force of Thor's attacks. So Thor takes off the other glove, and it creates a crater when he drops it on the ground. So that's pretty cool. I guess Thor is just constantly walking around with gloves that weigh many tons on his hands. So then he picks up Mjolnir. Gets this really cool shot of him picking it up and sort of the molten metal and earth coming off of it. And he picks it up and he asks Lubu for just one request, and that's don't die on me now. And you get this pretty neat shot of Thor holding up Mjolnir with both hands and all this electricity coming off of it, and Lubu just standing there staring right at him. Pretty cool stuff. And then, here, right after this huge big reveal, you get another way bigger reveal, and that is the roster. So, on this roster, we see all 13 fighters that will be on both sides. For the side of the gods, we have Zeus, Buddha, Loki, Apollo, Poseidon, Susanoo no Mikoto, Thor, Bishamonten, Anubis, Odin, Beelzebub, Shiva, and Heracles. So, some of the people that are on this list are characters that we've already been introduced to, which is pretty interesting. So you will get a general idea of what those characters will be like before they even fight. All the other ones, you'll just have to wait, because some of them have already fought, obviously, and some of them have not been revealed all yet, which is some of the excitement that comes from waiting for a new fight to start. But then on humanity's side, we have King Shi Huang, King Leonidas, from 300, Nikola Tesla, the inventor who was like rivals with Thomas Edison and arguably invented way more stuff than Thomas Edison. And you've got Sasaki Kojiro, Raiden Taimimon, Adam, Grigory Rasputin, that dude from Russia that they couldn't kill, Lubu, who's of course here now, Akita Soji, Michael Nostradamus, Simo Haya, Sakata Kentoki, and Jack the Ripper. So, with this roster, there are a few things I'd like to address. The first is the diversity of the different cultures and pantheons in here. So, one thing I'd like to say is that I'm fine with there being 4 Greeks and 4 people from Japan. The only issue I've had is that after this fight, they've thrown 3 of the 4 Greeks at us, so I'm just kind of tired of seeing them. Otherwise, if they, dispersed them out more, I probably would have, no issue whatsoever with this. But other than that, the god side actually has some real nice diversity in terms of the different pantheons. You've got, of course, Greek, and then Egyptian, Norse, Shinto. Beelzebub is a wild card, because we're not really sure yet which version of Beelzebub it'll be. If it's gonna be the demon from, Christianity, or if it's gonna be the, I think he was, a pagan god or something called Baal. So that's gonna be exciting to see. And then, with the human side, you have 4 Japanese fighters. You've got Sasaki Kojiro, Raiden Taimimon, Akita Soji, and Sakata Kentoki. So I know when this series first started coming out, people had issues with the fact that there were a lot of Japanese characters, and they were afraid that just the Japanese characters would win. So first off, I don't really care that there are that many Japanese fighters on there. As long as they're good, it doesn't matter to me. As long as they're good characters, I don't give a shit that they're Japanese. And as a matter, if they all win, which I don't think they will, I think at least one of them will die. Again, as long as they're just good characters, I don't care if they win or not. If their victory is satisfying, it doesn't matter to me. Also, this is a Japanese manga for a primarily Japanese audience, so of course they're going to have a lot of Japanese characters in there. You need to make material that's sort of geared towards your target audience, so that just makes sense. Alright, so after that, you go on to Chapter 5. This is a 6-chapter fight, so we're entering the final act of the fight. once the roster's been revealed, you get some character reactions from Brunhild and Geir talking about how the humans are the Einherjar, which are the army of human souls from actual Norse mythology. And then you have Zeus's reaction to the roster, which of course includes him, and he's very excited about it. Which I think his reaction is kind of weird, because you would think he would know that his name was on there if he's the one picking it. Which leads me to believe that Zeus is not the person picking the human fighters. Or, not the human fighters, the god fighters. And also, Brunhild's reaction, she seems very surprised by it. So, is she not the one picking the human fighters? Because the way that she sort of talks about who she's picking to fight later on, it seems like she intentionally picked those people because of the use that they could serve for their rounds, and that she picked them sort of assuming which gods would be sent to fight. Which I guess just suggests that Brunhild has like 500 IQ or something if she's able to predict exactly who the gods would be choosing to fight. But anyway, continuing on, everyone is pretty hype about the awakening of Mjolnir, especially we see Shiva's reaction, which is always nice. I like Shiva. I know there'll be a running joke with him once we get to round 2, but I like Shiva's design. I think he's neat. I'm very excited to see if he fights, especially since he's one of the Pantheon heads, so he's definitely going to be a powerhouse. But then we get some good shots of Thor using the awakened Mjolnir. So he does a very neat thing, which is he takes this giant car-sized Mjolnir and he fucking flings it at Lubu. And everyone freaks out. They talk about how in the Prose Edda, which is sort of like the source material for Norse mythology, I guess, that he would throw it at the skulls of Jotun to kill them instantly, and how it's never missed its mark once. So naturally it misses because Lubu dodges underneath it, and it flies right through the audience without killing anyone. But then Lubu starts rushing at Thor, who doesn't have his weapon anymore, and then it's revealed that Mjolnir's actually spinning around right behind him, coming right back towards Thor. So then Lubu just sort of hops over it, Thor catches it, and this is one of the more creative moves in any of the fights so far. So he grabs Mjolnir as it's spinning back towards him, plants his foot into the ground, and spins around using all of the momentum that Mjolnir's built up from flying through the air, and unleashes an attack called Gerard, or Gerard, something like that, which was the technique that he used on the serpent Jormungandr, which was the giant serpent that supposedly encircles the world in Norse mythology. So in doing this attack, Thor displays his finest smile. I'm not gonna lie, Thor's a pretty attractive man. And then Lubu meets it with his worst, which is kind of funny, because something that this series does, which is, I don't mind it. I know it may be kind of a turnoff to some people, but sometimes, usually for comedic effect, they'll have these really exaggerated faces on characters, and Lubu gives one of those. But he takes the Gerard attack, and then his giant buff horse, the red hair, starts freaking out after this. And you see that Lubu has actually managed to stop the attack, which is fucking insane if it was able to basically one-shot Jormungandr. But then you see that Lubu's legs have been horrifically broken. So this, if you didn't already realize it from seeing how Thor annihilated Incubus and some of the other stuff from the backstories, this series is very violent in sometimes. But Lubu seems pretty not bothered by his legs being super broken, like the bone is piercing through his skin. But even he, with all of his ridiculous superhuman strength, cannot stand on horrifically broken legs. So he kneels down, and it looks like Lubu's going to die. But then, his super swole horse, the red hare, jumps out, and Lubu hops on its back, and you get a pretty cool shot of Lubu riding the red hare with the light shining down on him from the sky. It's very nice. But then, with this, we move on to the final part of the fight. You get a little bit more of Lubu's backstory about when he was a kid, and he saw a tree get struck by lightning, and when he looked up into the heavens during this thunderstorm, he assumed that there was something amazing up there, which is pretty neat considering that he's now fighting Thor, who is the god of thunder and uses lightning, so that's actually pretty nice. Hermes questions Zeus about allowing for Lubu to ride the red hare since it's supposed to be a duel. And Zeus is like, no, that's a stupid argument. That horse is a part of Lubu, which is pretty cool statement coming from Zeus. And then you have Lubu charging at Thor on the red hare. And Lubu's army is getting super into this, especially as Lubu does something that's a really weird move that I've never seen before, which is he moves his hand back to grip the very end of his halberd, and he gets ready to do an attack that's supposed to be able to split the skies, called Sky Eater. And they show how back when he was alive, he had like 100 halberds that he kept going through to try and perfect the attack without breaking his halberd. And they finally show this really neat shot of him standing on like a cliff, and his attack split the skies open. It's a pretty impressive strength feat, how the movement of the air was able to do that. But the force of the attack literally disintegrates his halberd. But then we flash back to him using his apparently unbreakable divine weapon to use his ultimate strike. And Lubu's hype man, whose name I can't be bothered to remember, but he talks about how Lubu is been honing his ultimate technique with the ultimate weapon and directing it at his ultimate opponent. So with the culmination of this fight, you have Thor and Lubu, two people who were extremely bored by the fact they couldn't find anyone strong enough to fight them, doing their final clash, which is always one of my favorite parts of these fights, is when you have the two combatants doing their sort of, not necessarily final attacks, but the sort of final major exchange between the two characters. So you have Lubu using his Sky Eater technique, and Thor using his Garrod Thor Hammer technique, and the art gets super sketchy. It gets really rough, and they're both smiling. Thor is showing a smile more akin to Lubu. It's not that super attractive man smile, but you show the two attacks clashing with each other and light exploding out from the epicenter, and the whole arena is enveloped in this explosion that happens. And then you see that the halberd starts to break after the exchange. It couldn't handle it. And you also see that Lubu's body has been utterly destroyed by this. He's lost an arm, a leg, and his other arm is being held on by a few strands of meat. And they show that from the destruction of the halberd, Rangris seemingly disintegrates. Thor looks sort of disappointed by the fact that Lubu couldn't survive this attack, fully. So then Lubu, noticing how his body has been just destroyed, he rips off his barely remaining arm. He thinks about how he gave it everything he had, and rushes in at Thor on top of the red hare, and thinks about how finally fighting Thor he experienced true joy after his entire life of being bored, not being able to fight anyone stronger than him. And Thor gives sort of this nice smile here. And then he blows Lubu's fucking head off. And everyone is pretty shocked by this. Thor sort of flings Mjolnir to get the remnants of Lubu's face off of it, and Heimdall announces that the first match of Ragnarok has been decided, with Thor as the victor. And as Thor is walking off, he sort of looks at his wound and throws away the blood from his chest. And what I find kind of interesting here is that I would say Thor almost looks kind of sad, like he's lost something. Him and Lubu sort of went through the same backstory, and that they just went around fighting everyone, and were so bored that they couldn't find anyone that could really last against them. And the two of them finally found a worthy opponent to actually have, like, a real fight against. Of course, this is the last thing that Lubu ever did, and for Thor, he probably thinks that he'll never have a fight like that again. So, now that the fight is concluded, I'll give some overall thoughts about what I think about this fight. So, in my opinion, this is probably my least favorite fight, which is saying a lot because going over it again now, it's better than I remembered, which has happened before. After initially going through the fights, I didn't care for this one too much, but going over it again and talking about it like this, I definitely like it a lot more. But I still think it's probably my least favorite. And I'll give a few reasons for that. The first being that I don't think Thor and Lubu are that interesting. Like, I understand their character motivations, but I'm so strong, I'm so bored, I can't find anyone strong enough to fight me. I generally don't find that as interesting or compelling as some of the other character motivations that come up. The other thing is that I think, in comparison to the combat that you get from some of the fights after this, or really all of the fights out of this, that it just feels kind of plain. But it's still cool, especially with Mjolnir, which is just so ridiculous that seeing Thor swing it around is always something of a spectacle. But the issue is that it's really just him swinging it around in various different ways. But I still think it's neat. Now, in terms of how I think this sort of affects the series overall, obviously is the first match, and being the introduction into the series, essentially. I think it does a very good job at sort of setting the groundwork for what to expect. You have the establishment of the Volund and the stakes of the tournament, and you get introduced to the general format of the fights. I also think, based on sort of the characterizations of the two fighters and the way that the fight ends, mostly with Thor's reaction, that the author was sort of getting a handle of what they were going to be doing with all of the future fights. And it definitely shows, because I think with round 2 and I would say round 4, you get a lot of the feel that you sort of get from the end of this fight, but taken to a much greater extent, because I just think that the characters in those fights are way more interesting and complex than Thor and Lubu. However, this is still a pretty good start. This is definitely a good introduction to the series. It's such a good expectation for what sort of insane stuff you're going to expect from seeing a bunch of fights between humans and gods. But yeah, I think that's everything I have to say about this. Definitely a good fight. Not the best. We'll see what happens with future fights. At the moment, because there's only 4 completed fights so far, it's kind of hard to tell how this will stack up overall, but I have a feeling, just based entirely on the fact of how the writing has sort of developed as the series has progressed, that this will probably remain the low point of the fights, which is a great sign, because to have a fight that's good like this as the low point can only mean good things for the progression of the series. But yeah, that is that is all I have to say about round 1 of Record of Ragnarok. If you enjoyed, please consider liking and subscribing. I will be doing, of course, videos talking about the matches after this, and once I'm finished with those, I plan on doing reviews for the individual chapters when they come out every month. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed.